Welcome to the Love Lab Podcast, a safe and fun place to get real and learn about sex. Whether you're a man or woman, single or couple, this is the show for you. I am your host, Kevin Anthony, and I am here to guide you to go from good to amazing in the bedroom and your relationships. All right, welcome back to the Love Lab Podcast. This is episode 330, and it is titled, Your Apology Sucks and How to Fix It. I think this is going to be a great conversation, but also a little bit of a fun one too. Obviously, with the title, Your Apology Sucks, that's going to raise some eyebrows, right? So we're going to really be talking in this episode about sort of the art of apologizing. So I have a whole bunch of questions. I have a guest with me today. He's going to help me unpack this. He actually wrote a book about it. And we're really going to be talking about things like, why is apologizing important? Like, how would you do a good apology? What are some of the mistakes that people make? What is the right time to apologize? How do you start a conversation about it? All of these things, because so many people think they do a good job of apologizing and really, really don't. And it's really interesting because you see this a lot as a coach. When you're working with a couple and you watch one of them apologize to the other one, it's like half apology and half like criticism, dig, here's what you actually did wrong, which obviously negates, the apology that came before it or even after it, really. So we're really going to unpack that because this is really an essential skill. In relationships, conflicts happen. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody screws up, right? And when that happens, we need to take ownership of it and we need to apologize for it. However, we want to do it in a way that actually creates a resolution and makes things better rather than creating more problems later on down the road. So that's what we're going to unpack today in this episode. I'm actually really excited to have this conversation because I've never had anyone on the show talk specifically about apologies and like creating frameworks to make this easier. So I think this could be really valuable for the people listening. And I'm really curious to hear what some of these tools might be. So looking forward to that. Before we do it, a short word from my sponsor, Power and Mastery 3.0. Power and Mastery 3.0 is the latest version of the popular men's sexual mastery course. If you are struggling with erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, or simply want to increase your skills in the bedroom, then Power and Mastery is for you. Join the exclusive club of men who have taken their sexual performance into their own hands and become sexual masters. Mastering your sexuality is a key component to becoming the man she has always dreamt of and craves. Don't leave your sexual performance up to chance or the throw of the dice. Become a sexual master today by going to powerandmastery.com and joining the exclusive club of men who have taken their destiny into their own hands. That's powerandmastery.com. Okay, my guest today is Dr. Jon Dabach, and he is a marriage counselor and relationship coach for over 13 years, helping over 3,000 relationships along the way. He's got over 400,000 followers on his social media profiles and plans on helping people with their relationships until the day he dies. Welcome to the show, Jon.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
I realized when I was reading your bio that I did not ask you the proper way to pronounce your name. So did I get that right, or was I?
You were close. Off? You were honestly, if I wasn't listening so intensely, I would have just said, yeah, it's Dabach. Although it depends on who you ask, but that's the way we say it, Dabach.
All right, great. I hate mispronouncing guests' names. And I realized I'm like, oh no, I didn't ask him beforehand.
I don't think in my entire life anyone's got it right the first time. So don't worry.
All right. So obviously we're going to be talking about apologizing today. And, I'm guessing you've seen bad apologizing a lot because there has to be a reason why you chose to write a whole book on this. I'm curious, could you talk a little bit about, how often do you find people getting it wrong? Like, how big of a problem is this? Is this something that's just a few couples, most couples, or does everybody really screw this up?
I think if you find yourself talking to a therapist or a coach, chances are either you or your partner or both have not apologized in a way that has felt fulfilling enough to actually not see a therapist or a coach, with very very few exceptions. So it's something that everybody's very very bad at naturally. I'm because we're not taught how to apologize correctly. Really, like nobody really sits down and says this is how you apologize. You know, you hear kids say or parents say to their kids like, no, you have to mean it. And it's like, what the hell does that mean? You know, when you're 5 years old, like what does mean it mean? Does that mean I put on sad eyes? You know, like, so there's this expression of remorse that's kind of beat into you, but that's really only a very small portion of what's needed in an intimate relationship. Or, you know, and when I say intimate, it could be best friends, it could be employee to employer. In my world and in yours, it's about a husband and wife, or two people who are together. And there's more to it than that. So it's not surprising, but most people, the vast majority of people, really do suck at apologizing.
Yeah, I will say that has been my experience also, just in the work that I do coaching people. I see it's a skill that is lacking in most everybody. But even in my own life, if I'm honest and I look back, like I can look back at past relationships I've had and see like where I was just really bad at it, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And you kind of answered this already, but I kind of want to ask it again. Maybe we can get a little deeper
yeah,
into it.
sure.
And that is, why are so many people bad at it? Okay, so we weren't taught, right? Why
Mhm.
weren't we taught? Or if we were taught anything at all, why weren't we taught the right thing?
Um, Well, I think that the vast majority of people aren't taught how to apologize well because their parents didn't know how to apologize well, and really what the point of an apology is. And so they just know if someone does something. I mean, it's kind of weird on a psychological level. If someone doesn't express remorse, there's a kind of fear that we have as parents that the person might be a sociopath or a psychopath. It's like, please just express some kind of remorse. And it's like, so as soon as you see your child expressing remorse, whether it's to another child you have, or to you or to whoever, you're like, okay, thank God, my kid's normal, right? He has the ability, or she has the ability to actually be remorseful. And that's where it ends. But that, you know, apologizing really isn't just about proving that you're not a sociopath. It's about rebuilding the relationship, and processing resentment. So the first reason is because people just don't know how to do it themselves. So if your teacher doesn't know how to do something, the student has no chance. And then the second reason is, apologizing requires you to be able to be vulnerable. And that's hard for a lot of people. It's hard for parents, it's hard for people in a romantic relationship. Depending on your attachment style and your own history, it could feel like you're completely exposed when you apologize, because when as soon as you admit that you're part of the problem, there's a fear that the person will leave you. So there's a lot of moving pieces.
Yeah, for sure. And I find it so interesting that relationships are such a huge part of our life. Like most people, and there are some exceptions, but most people want to have and do have an intimate relationship in their life. And yet, all of the core skills that it takes to do this well are never taught. They don't teach us any of this stuff in school. Now, of course, maybe if you went into the field of psychology, in college, you may have learned some of this stuff. But if you didn't, they didn't teach you any of these things. And sometimes it just blows my mind that such core skills like how to be in a relationship are just simply not taught at all.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's really sad. I think, you know, psychology in general is a new field, relative to things, something like mathematics, especially. And then when you think of psychology, from like a Freudian or a Jungian standpoint, you know, kind of the stereotypical thing you'll see in the movies, it's about becoming okay with yourself. So the relational aspect is even newer. And whenever things are new, you know, they take a while for it to kind of permeate society. And I also think that our gender roles and the way we look at intimate relationships, I think we're about the same age. I'm in my early 40s, and I saw a shift even in my own lifetime to the way people acted in romantic relationships, what the expectations are, what gender roles were. So relationships are still very fluid in terms of like what is healthy, what isn't. We always think that we know the best now because it's the most up to date information, but there were people who were able to stay married a lot longer, a lot more consistently back then. So who knows? Maybe there was something to more specific roles, but you're right. I mean, it's not something that's talked about much at all. And I think it's a luxurious thing. I always talk about like think about a third world country. The last thing on their mind for most of them is how to have a great relationship. They're just concerned with survival, right? A lot of them are just where do I get my food from? How do I make sure I'm safe? Is there a civil war going on? And so you don't have to worry about how sensitive somebody was when they commented about your shoes. So that's also part of the reason it's new. It's just these are kind of first world new problems where, you can get anything from the store in 2 days with Amazon. So now let's turn inward towards our relational lives because that's the only thing left.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you bring up. I mean, obviously, if you're stuck in survival mode, you don't really have time to worry about or think about or focus on these things. And, it's kind of sad, right? Because all of the truly great things that humans have discovered, accomplished, created come from having that excess, time and capacity and brain power to solve and create, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really interesting point, and not something I'd really thought of beforehand. Is that for the overwhelming majority of people on the planet, this is not something they really have the capacity to do.
And
But
you see that also just in therapy in general. Sorry to interject, but there are any study you read on anything in psychology will take into account demographic variations on their approach to therapy. So someone from a minority or a foreign family, so kind of like a new to America, will always be more resistant to therapy, just across the board as a generalization, because they were concerned with coming here. They were concerned with actually getting their footing, so they didn't have time to worry about anxiety and depression unless it was incredibly severe, or we would call it acute.
yeah, and that's kind of sad. This is why I really wish we as a society could get together and try to raise the overall standard of living for
Mm-hmm.
people so that they could get out of survival mode and then start to focus on the things that really advance our lives and our consciousness, because that's a lot of this is what we're talking about, is really advancing our consciousness, right?
Right. Yeah.
So that's a whole other discussion for another
Yeah.
day.
Yeah. For sure. I'll go off on tangents if you don't rein me in. Sorry.
No, it's all good. Let's go back to something you talked about a little earlier, which was the importance of apologizing. So you mentioned a couple reasons, and I'm wondering if there are more. Let's talk about why is it so important to get good at doing real apologies?
So I look at relationships as or the quality of relationships really being a result of two core skills: building closeness and resolving conflict. Now, building closeness, there's lots of ways to do that in your relationship, but apologies are a kind of a pillar of resolving conflict. So when I think of conflict, I think of it as the before, during, and after. If you know you're going to talk about a touchy subject, there's a way to start that conversation with grace and with eloquence. If you're in the middle of a conflict, there's intervention techniques on how to stop the fight. But most of us miss those two. And what we end up with are these battle scars in our relationship because this person said this once, or she called me fat, or she said she wasn't pleased in bed, or he said that he always wanted someone was a little more this way. And those wounds are things we carry with us in the relationship kind of forever. And the only way to reframe those scars and let them heal is through apologizing. If someone says something that's hurtful or does something that's hurtful, you can undo it only so much with your actions. You have to, at the end of the day, if you really want to heal, tell someone what's going on inside your head, and kind of let them in. Nobody's a mind reader, at least nobody I've ever met. and not a true one that they can read all your thoughts. And so if you said something in anger, or if you said something but you've had a change of heart, or you've done something but there's not just remorse, but a real awakening that you can't do that behavior anymore, the apology is the only way to let the person know, the only way to let the person know that you've made a change, on an intellectual level with any kind of eloquence. And so if you don't do that, that battle wound of being in the relationship will never heal.
Yeah, and this is a really important point to make. This is something that I think a lot of people don't get, because they have this idea that, okay, you fight, whatever, and then the fight's over and it's over, right? But it's not necessarily over. And even though they may just be words, right? Words can be like daggers, right? And they can hurt and they can leave scars. And over time, all those little things build up, right? And
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
the better job we can do with the apologizing, the more we can help heal those, so we're not carrying them on throughout the relationship, so they're not coming back over and over again, right? I'm sure you've seen this too, right? Where one person in the couple brings something up from 10 years ago, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Like,
For
why would
sure.
you bring something up from 10 years ago? It's because you haven't healed it yet,
Yeah,
right? It's still an issue
absolutely.
for you.
Yeah. What do you, I'm curious. It's always fun to compare notes when you're working with your own clients. Do you see people resisting apology? Do you feel like they try to just avoid it altogether? How do you handle that when you're working with people?
uh, I see people resist apology, but it's it's not so much that they're like, I just refuse to apologize because I'm right. Like, I don't see that as much with the clients I'm working. It's more like resisting a good apology. In other words, if you tell them they should apologize, most of the time they're like, yeah, I should probably apologize. But the way they fight the apology when they're trying to give the apology, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, I know I should apologize and I'm trying to do it, but it usually ends up being a mess that doesn't really help. I don't often see it make things worse, but I often don't see it help.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like you have this kind of ball of wax with like yarn, and they start untangling it, and then somewhere along the lines they start respooling it and making it a ball again. And you're like, no, you're like, what are you doing? Like, you were so close.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Well,
it is. It's hard to watch.
and that's something I definitely want to talk about in a moment. I'm not sure that we're 100% done with the importance thing, so I
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
come.
sure, sure,
I
sure.
want to come back, but I do want to talk at some point about, obviously, like, how do you do a proper apology, right?
Of
Because
course, yeah.
when I say I see them apologize, but it's not helping, there's reasons for that, right? There's reasons why this apology is completely not landing, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
for
I
sure, for
definitely
sure.
want to get into that, but okay. So the first point you made about the importance of apologizing was that, these create scars, and the best way to heal them is through doing, a proper, heartfelt, like, apology, where you actually mean it and you show some remorse, and you show that you're willing to change or do better, right?
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the only ways you can make someone a nice dinner, but if you shout it at them, how much is that really going to undo the shouting? I mean, some people have grown in their relationship. And I wrote the book with my wife, and she's not the best at apologizing. So it's kind of an interesting exercise, and she readily admits it. She said it's harder for her, whereas I was kind of born groveling. So so it's a little bit different, but sometimes people can grow into these relationships where they understand, well, if my wife puts her head on my shoulder, that's her way of apologizing. But that takes a pretty generous person. That takes someone who's really done a lot of inner work and says, hey, my partner or my best friend or my parent just will not learn how to apologize. And so I have to take this action or this little, kiss on the cheek or whatever it is that they're offering as their apology. But that's few and far between, for people to be like that generous.
I have to say, so prior to my wife, my girlfriend, prior to my wife, would absolutely never apologize for anything, like
Yeah.
ever, even when it was like blatantly obvious that she really messed up.
Yeah.
And how I would know that she would recognize it is she would just go quiet. She would stop, complaining or whatever was happening. She would just go quiet and then like pretend like it never happened. Now, I understood that that was her recognition that she had messed up. But I
Yeah.
have to tell you, even though I understood it, it always grated on me, always, that she would never actually say the words.
Yeah.
So even if you recognize that when she puts her head on your shoulder, or she goes quiet, or she stops complaining, or whatever it is, that is a form of recognition and
Sure.
apology. Maybe it's just me, but like
No, that's
all
most people that like you want to hear it.
that's all I needed to hear were those two words, no explanation even. She could just say I'm sorry and go quiet. That would have been enough.
Yeah, I
Right?
have a bit of sarcasm in my personality, and like I got so tired earlier on. My wife's much better now, but earlier on in the relationship, when she wouldn't apologize and go quiet, much like your ex-girlfriend did, when she got super close and we would hug, I would just give her the words in like a high-pitched voice. I'd be like, "I'm so sorry, John, for all the bad things I did. Oh, don't worry about it, honey. Okay, I'm glad you forgive me." And she would laugh, but she wouldn't deny it. And so that like I got a little closer, but because at least the words were out in the air and she could say that's not how I felt, but she never did. So maybe that'll help some people if you have a personality that could pull that off. But that's kind of like a weird random tangential thought that I had about how you can kind of get there, but you're right, you want to hear it at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the important points for people to take away when we're talking about, why this is important. Is it's important because in order to really properly heal, people just need to hear it. And they need to feel it and believe it as well. It can't just be like, "Yeah, I'm sorry."
For
Right?
sure. Yeah, that's in fact those could be more damaging than not apologizing when someone's flippant about it.
Yeah, because you don't believe it, and you're just like, "You're blowing me off."
Mm-hmm. Totally.
So let's talk about what is the right time to apologize. Like, we understand it's important to apologize, but one thing I often see is people are not really sure like when the right time is. Like, should I do it right away in this moment? Should I wait till things cool down and do it later? Does it even matter or count if I wait until later? Like, what really is the right time?
There's no perfect time to apologize. There are imperfect times to apologize. I mean, I think that there's a pretty large window. So like if someone says, "Well, that happened 6 months ago, I can't apologize for it now," I would say I've seen partners in my own practice apologize for something that happened 30 years ago and it's still being incredibly impactful. Um, I think the right time to apologize is when when your partner is ready to actually hear it. So if you're in the middle of a fight and their pulse is up and they can't focus and they're just seeing red and are angry, might not be the best time, right? That might be the best time to just say, "Hey, we need to take a break," because there's no real coming back from someone who's on like an adrenaline rush and fight or flight mode. But a good way to check if someone's ready for an apology is if you ask, if you say, "Hey, I would like to apologize for something." Don't get too specific, right? "I'd like to apologize for something. Do you have some time now to go over it? Are you open to hearing it?" And they'll answer one of three ways: yes, in which case it's green light; no, then don't continue. Or they'll give you a flippant, "Well, it depends," or "Yeah, I guess." In which case you have to kind of proceed with caution. You could, if someone says, "Well, of course I want an apology," like, "Well, obviously, but you're not going to give me a good one." Then you have to say, like, because that could very well be the case that you've just never been good at it before. You have to say, like, "Look, no, I want to do this right, and I want to make sure that you hear me. Um, can you give me a real shot?" And if there's quiet, if there's a pause after you say something like that, then I would say go for it. But if they keep attacking you, just say, "It seems like you're not really in a space where you want to talk calmly, and I respect that, and I understand I caused a lot of this tension. It's not your fault, but maybe we'll try again later. That it's just learning to kind of read the room a little bit. Easier said than done if you don't have that natural ability, but hopefully those questions will get you a little bit closer.
Would you say it's better, like, so you're trying to read the room, you're trying to
Yeah.
figure out if this is a good time. Would you say it's better to sort of err on the side of giving the apology rather than not, or vice
Yeah.
versa? Yeah.
No, I think, people tend to apologize not enough as opposed to over apologizing. There are exceptions, right? There are people who come to my practice, and especially you find it with people pleasers. So if you're a man or a woman who just rolls over backwards and is constantly trying to please your partner, that gets annoying because what happens is you say yes all the time, you say sorry all the time, but it doesn't have a lot of follow through, and then the next chance you get to disappoint him, you can. So if that's the case, then yeah, they might say, "Oh, they say sorry all the time, doesn't mean anything." That's a whole different scenario. But for anyone that's not in that position, you should always strive to apologize. I mean, I remember I was at a engagement party years ago, and the parents of the bride got up to give, or the bride to be got up to give a little like toast. And the mom went on for like 10 minutes about everything, this and that. And the dad had these, I mean, it shows you how powerful it was. I still remember it. He said, there are three things that you need to learn to say and say them often. You're right. I'm wrong. I'm sorry. He's like, that will solve 80%. And he's right. It's like, sometimes people just need to remember, like, just saying that often and not having to hold on to who's right really does solve a lot of the nonsense in relationship.
Would you suggest that somebody do that even if the other person technically isn't right?
So no, I don't think lying is a good strategy for apologizing. I
Okay.
think that's going to set you up for going back on your word. It's going to set you up for the person saying, but you said this and you're doing that, and so you don't want to lie. But there's usually room for you to apologize for something. Um, and I can go into details even with some things in my own life where my wife wanted me to apologize for something where I felt like I didn't do anything wrong, and so I apologized for the way I approached it. But I even told her if I had to do this all over again, I would still make this decision. And sometimes you have to be comfortable in your relationship, accepting that you guys have different vantage points. And sometimes you have deal breakers, like if you get to a deal breaker and the relationship has to end, sometimes that's the right thing to do. Um, but no, I don't think lying is ever a good idea.
Good. I just wanted to make sure that was totally clear, that the
Yeah,
audience, the audience understood that the advice dad was giving wasn't just to always say, "Well, you're right, I was wrong," right? Like it
no, that's
has to
that's a
be,
disaster. Yeah,
it has to be legit, right?
yeah,
Exactly. One of the ways that I have approached that in the past is, to not necessarily apologize for the thing if I'm, very confident that I'm correct, but apologize for maybe how it landed on them,
sure.
right? So, I might say, well, I do believe that, I made the right decision, but I recognize how it came across to you. Maybe I didn't explain it properly, or maybe it didn't land properly, or you can even apologize for how it made you feel, even though it might have been the right thing. You didn't like the way it felt, right? So there are ways that you can apologize for a
Sure.
situation without actually having to say, I was wrong. Now, if you were wrong, you should own it.
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
but in some instances, you're like, well, that was technically the correct thing, right?
Sure.
So
Sure. You have to be a little careful in when you're apologizing for something else. Um, but because it can often, if I'll give you an example, there's a chapter in the book called the non-apologies, and like one of the classic non-apologies is I'm sorry if you felt that way, right? And it's like that's really that it's a backhanded insult where it's like I'm not the problem, you misinterpreted it, and that gets a little tricky because it sounds like an apology. If your partner's not super articulate, they might say, well, I can't get angry at them because they're technically saying sorry. And they're not going to know like how to say that's a non-apology. But you know, it's almost better to kind of dive into the nitty-gritty with your partner at that point, as opposed to saying, well, you got offended and I'm sorry you were offended, but that wasn't my intention. What you're really saying in that sentence is you're the problem, not me. And that's like the opposite of what an apology is. An apology, by its very definition, has to accept some of the blame, if not all of the blame.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate you adding some clarity to that, because what I was trying to express was having an acknowledgement for how the other person is feeling based on a situation, right? So in other words, taking their feelings into account rather than dismissing how they feel about something. That's what I was trying to get across. But you're right. If you're not careful, it can actually come across as dismissing their feelings.
Right. Yeah. And I think acknowledging and validating their feelings, your intention there is fantastic. Like that's huge. That's kind of the biggest part of it. The way you do it has to be done with a lot of compassion, but that is the right goal. Yeah, you want to make the person feel heard for sure.
Yeah. Okay, we're about halfway through. I got to take a quick break. I have a lot more things that I want to talk to you about, one of which we've kind of hit on in little bits and pieces. But before this episode is over, we absolutely have to give people a framework for how to create a good apology. So definitely want to make sure we get to that. We also have, I want to talk a little bit about conflict too. Something we talked about in the pre-interview call was this idea of before, during, and after, right? And so we definitely want to hit those points. So right after this break, we will get to those things and a few more. Are you a couple? Are your relationship and sex life where you want them to be? Are there changes you would like to make but just don't know how? Maybe you think there's nothing that can be done. If you are not 100% happy with where your relationship or sex life is, then get help today and change your life. Go to kevinandceline.com/sex-coaching-couples. Don't worry about the long link. It's in the description. All you got to do is click on it and schedule a strategy call with me today so we can map out a strategy to get you where you want to be so you can have it all your way. That is kevinandceline.com/sex-coaching-couples and book your strategy call today. Okay, so let's go to conflict. So you talk about there's a before, a during, and an after. What exactly do you mean by that?
We all have kind of triggers in our relationship. We all have differences with our partner, and they cause problems. The way you deal with family, finances, sex, parenting, social circles, there's going to be differences. And so those differences often will create conflict. If you've been in a relationship long enough to have a fight, so, you know, for some people that's 2 dates, for some people it's 6 months, but eventually we all get there. Chances are you're going to know where you guys tend to fight, right? I could tell you the 2 places my wife and I always fight about, and then the one that kind of sneaks in once in a while. And that's it. Like after being together for 15 plus years now, those are the only things we really argue about. And so if there's a problem in one of those arenas and I want to bring it up because I want to make a slight change, or I'm looking for an apology, or I need to apologize, or whatever it is, or there's something that's coming up that I want to see happen a certain way, before you bring it up, having the right mindset on how to bring up a potential fight is crucial. So in the Gottman world, they have something called a soft startup, and they did some really interesting empirical kind of research and evidence-based, practices here that kind of informed the best way to bring up touchy subjects. And it's all about kind of lowering someone's defensive shield. And the way you do it, it's worth looking up to. Again, it's called a soft startup. They have worksheets. You can look it up online. It's probably going to go way over the kind of the context of this podcast, but it's worth looking into. But everybody, if you're bringing up a naturally touchy subject, the person is going to feel like it's an attack or a criticism. And so, You have to use language and you have to use perspective that lets them know you're not trying to attack. You're trying to solve a problem that's affecting both of you. You're a team. And so the way you present the conversation so it doesn't become a fight, that's the before, how you bring it up. The during is if you find yourself in the middle of a fight. Conflicts often escalate and escalate quickly, very quickly. So you could be talking and someone could say, what? And even just the way they say what will get you to go, oh, here we go again. And then you find yourself off to the races. And the research has shown that the way a fight starts within 2 minutes, basically that's the way the conversation goes the whole time. So if you start fighting, which is why they call it before the soft startup technique. If you start fighting, I don't care if you're fighting for 10 minutes or you're one of those couples that fights for 4 hours and stays up till 2 a.m. The way it starts is typically the way it continues for the whole length of the argument until someone says, I don't want to talk about this anymore, and they walk away. And that's when the stonewalling resentment part of it kind of creeps in, and one person has to kind of realize, I still want to be in the relationship. How are we going to patch this up? Do we just ignore it? Do I apologize? Do they apologize, etc.? So what you do during conflict is, the most important thing I could tell people is learn to take a time out, right? If you guys are heated, just say, hey, let's take a break, 20 minutes, and really figure out if we can kind of get back on the track. When they did their love lab, the Gottmans actually had to lie to the test subjects in order to get them to stop fighting. They couldn't, in 40 years of the research, or 50 now, they could not figure out how to get people to stop fighting in the middle of a fight. They just didn't, none of the tools worked. So what they would do is they're looking through this one-way mirror. They would come into the room and lie to the couple, say, hey, our equipment's broken on monitoring you, whether it was like an EKG or a video camera, whatever it was. Would you mind taking a break on the fight and just let us get our equipment back in order? And they would go back to their side of the mirror and just watch the heart rate on the EKGs and just wait till it normalized again for that subject. And once it was normal, usually, between 15 minutes and a half hour, they'd lie again. They'd go back to the subjects and say, hey, the equipment's working again. Go ahead and continue the fight. And that was the only thing that worked. And so they're like, oh, okay, I guess the answer is to take a break. And they call that being flooded, right? So if your heart rate's too high, a different part of your brain's being activated, and you need to learn to take breaks. I mean, they've done MRIs. A different part of the brain lights up when you're in fight or flight mode, and you don't have the same ability to be compassionate and be part of a team. You kind of get into this every man for himself mode, and it's very dangerous. So that's the during, right? That's the during part.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm a huge fan of the break. Okay, we got to take a break. We got to pause for a moment here, because sometimes that's really the only thing that will actually work.
I've tried things in session that sometimes work. Usually, I mean, the most impactful one is asking one of the two partners to step out of the room, or if they're on a Zoom, to take a walk around the block. So at least I get one of them to continue processing. But that's a version of a break. Sometimes I'll redirect and say, hey, we're going to change gears completely. And I even have note cards in my desk handy, and I will write cue cards. And literally, if they're in office, I will write a prompt for them to start saying and continue, and hand it to them. And it's like a break, but it's with some intervention there where I could say, name 3 things you like about your partner. And then I could hand to them the other person, talk about your most happy moment with and so it's just a complete 180. Even that takes time to calm them down. The reason I try to look for those things in session is because if people are seeing me for an hour, if I have to take a 20 or 30-minute break, it's such a waste of their time. So I've had to learn different things, but if it's just the two of you, the break is the go-to. That is the go-to technique. for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I always call it the timeout. You know,
Yeah,
so we got to
that's
take a
right.
timeout. That's what we call it. But I really like your idea of. I would classify your second strategy, like in terms of neurolinguistic programming. We would call that a pattern interrupter, right?
Right.
So what you're creating is something to interrupt that pattern of fighting, right, and sort of redirect, which is really cool. I think that's a really great tool.
Yeah, it works for me. Came from like desperation like years ago, but it worked. And what I found is, years later, couples who would come back for like a little touch-up session or something like that once in a while, if there was a loss in the family, they would often say, sometimes when we're in the middle of a fight, I see myself holding that note card saying, okay, what would I do if I had a note card in my hand? So there is some reprogramming, like if you're using the NLP language there, that does happen, and that's great. You learn how to self-talk in a different way, which is super useful.
Yeah. So we still have
The
the
after.
after part. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
So the after, that's the core of the apology. It takes someone, kind of the peacekeeper, to initiate rebuilding the bridge to being a couple. Sometimes that's the one who needs to apologize, sometimes not. I have found that there's one of the two partners takes that role on over 90% of the time. So usually there's someone in a relationship that knows, if we're going to start talking again, it's on me. And sometimes they get burned out, and they're like, well, they can, if they're really upset about this, they can come to me. If that happens, you always wait longer. Because it's like that person's just not used to kind of restarting things. So it takes someone being courageous enough to initiate that rebuilding. And then the core of it is the apology. I mean, everybody wants a kind of a post-game wrap-up of what the heck just happened. And so you have to kind of like retrace your steps. Why did we get in a fight? Why are we so angry? How are we going to fix this? All of that is part of an apology, really. But so the before technique that I recommend is the soft startup. The during technique is the timeout, right? Taking a break, or if you can do a pattern interrupter, like a note card thing, you can try. It's hard for two people to do that. It's it's easier with a third party, but you can learn to do it. And then the after is the apology. Those are kind of the three techniques, and that's where conflict lives. It lives in your mind, in anxiety when you know it's going to happen. It lives, as a direct threat in the moment. And in the afterwards, it lives as resentment, and sometimes even it can grow into hatred or contempt of one another. And so the apology is the way to fix that.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to one thing you shared on the before. It's something that I talk about a lot, and I just think it's so valuable, which is, you were talking about, okay, we're a team here, and how can we work together as a team to resolve the issue? And I think if more couples saw themselves as a team working together, it would really, really reduce the number of conflicts that they have and make the ones they do have easier to solve. Because when we think about conflict, we're thinking like two sides, right?
Right.
And the idea in a couple is you're supposed to be on the same side,
Yeah.
right? Now, it doesn't mean the same side always agrees,
Sure.
but the way you approach how you solve the problem, if you realize you're on the same side, it's probably going to be different than if you think you're on opposite sides.
Yeah. I think that's the exact right attitude. I think, it's are we a team? I think we both want this, or I really need this. Can you give it to me? If not, I either need to learn to accept it or get out of the relationship. So there are very few things that are super black and white. A good example would be, some people are okay with an open relationship. The vast majority of people are not, right? And so if one person needs to have multiple partners, very often that's a deal breaker and you're done. And so getting clarity on that's great, but learning to know, like, hey, is this something we can agree on? I want to know for the health of our relationship. Do you view monogamy this way? Just as like a very kind of big example. And if they say yes, great. So let's talk about why I felt that was a violation. And like, maybe you have a difference of opinion, but let's get to the truth of what we both believe. That's a better attitude, as opposed to, you follow someone on Instagram and I don't like who you follow. It's like, what the heck? Like, out of nowhere, what are you talking about? That approach just kind of doesn't work ever.
Yeah, I agree. I always look at the team thing. It's like when you're first dating, you're sort of getting to know each other. You don't necessarily see each other as being on the same team, but there's a certain point in that dating process where you make this commitment, like, this is the person that I'm going to be with. And I think that that's the moment when you have to say, this person's now on my team, or I'm on their team, or we created a new team together, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's a certain point there in that process where it's like, if I'm going to choose to continue to be with this person, I got to let him into the inner workings of my team, right? And then start approaching the relationship as a team from that point forward.
Yeah, and sometimes you see people not take that mentality for decades. So they have this secret bank account, or they never tell their partner or what their family thinks of them. And it's like sometimes unwinding those habits are really hard. But you're right, the healthy relationships don't have those. It's this complete transparency, like, what I'm thinking, where I am, you have access to anything and everything you want, and vice versa. Those are the healthy, happy relationships that really exist.
Yeah, I totally agree. Okay, a couple more things here before we wrap up. We got a few more minutes left. I'm curious, this came up as well in the process of apologizing, this idea of empathy. And I'm wondering if you have some ideas on how couples can help cultivate empathy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of a good transition to how, like, what are the steps of apologizing? Because empathy is the first one. Um, as if you take nothing else away from, and you listen to this whole talk and you take nothing else away, the one big message is apologizing is 80% listening, 20% talking. And so when you're trying to build empathy, you're trying to signal to your partner that you understand the pain that they were in, that you caused. That's really an important point. You caused it, whether you intended to cause it or not. The bottom line is, if you weren't around, that pain wouldn't be there. It's much like a rental car, right? Like, the rental car, whether if you're parked on the street and somebody hits your car, you're still responsible for it. And let's take insurance out of the picture. But their attitude is, well, if it was in our warehouse, right, it wouldn't have gotten hit on that side of the street. So whether you're part of it or not, there's still some onus, some ownership of that responsibility, of that pain, that suffering. And so very often, someone will want to feel that you understand the pain as an insurance policy to make sure it doesn't happen again. One of the dangerous, toxic ways someone will do this without an apology is by inflicting the same pain on you as revenge, right? So if someone cheats on me, I have to cheat on you to even up the score. Very often you'll hear the partner say, well, I can't say anything because I did it to them. But really, that creates a lot of break and damage in the relationship. But it doesn't have to be something even that extreme. It could be something as small as, they were supposed to do the dishes and they didn't apologize. So now I'm not going to do their laundry. Right. And then it's just like this snowballing effect of people kind of taking it out on each other, when really what they're trying to say is, you hurt me and I need you to see how much that hurt so that you don't do it again. But instead of talking about it, they have this weird passive aggressive way of kind of just making things worse for both of them. So if you're able to convey through speech and through listening that you understand the pain, that temptation to even up the score tends to go away in the majority of cases. And so how do you actually do that? And this is the first step of apologizing, is you sit down and you say, I want to apologize, make sure the person's open to it. And then you say, this is what I think happened. How did it make you feel? Tell me everything. And you let them talk. You do not interrupt, right? If someone says, let's say I broke my wife's favorite coffee mug, right? And I think it's like a small thing. I still want to know everything that's going through her head, because the truth is, you don't know. You don't know what's going through the person's head. So you let them talk. My wife might say, that was my favorite coffee mug. You have no idea. I go to like from store to store. I always look for coffee mugs. They're usually 8 ounces or 12. This one's 16, but it's not too big to fit in the cabinet. And so it's that perfect size. And they don't make it anymore. I've called the manufacturer to get a backup and it's just not made anymore. So the only way to get that mug again is for me to go to a clay oven and make the damn mug myself. And I don't know how to use the clay oven. And so now you're hearing more information that you had no idea about. Right? It's like, oh my God, she's put so much effort into it. So when I broke the coffee mug, it wasn't just breaking a coffee mug. It was undoing 1 year of research on coffee mugs that she was, and there's no way to fix it. Right. And so you're sitting there listening to all this and you just listen. And so that's step one of empathy.
Before we go to step 2, that was absolutely huge what you just said. It needs to be repeated, which is the fact that when somebody gets really angry at us for something, a lot of the time we do not understand the real reason why. We only see the surface, right? And we probably have our own assumptions that we've put in there. But that description you gave of all the actual reasons why break, because, like guys, a lot of times we tend to be a little bit overly simplistic and we'd be like, this is a coffee mug. I'll buy another one, right?
Right.
Without realizing all of the details that are there underneath the surface. And it's so much easier for you to have empathy for somebody once you understand those details. So this is something I see in my work all the time, is when you can get somebody to understand the details underneath it, suddenly they go, oh, I had no idea how important that coffee cup was for you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think you summarized something I was kind of talking around really well, is like you want them to understand the details. You want them to understand the nuance as to why it hurts so much. And so the kind of the more interesting and the most surprising part of this empathy comes from the next step, right? Which is you listen, and you wait for that pause in the conversation. After my wife does that whole thing on the coffee mug, I say, wow, is there anything else? And you give them space. And lo and behold, my wife might say something like, well, I wasn't going to bring it up, but now that you mention it, the day I bought that mug was the day that my grandmother found out that she had cancer. And like, I've always associated that mug also with my grandmother. And I've been missing her a lot lately because it was her birthday the other week and I've just been in a really bad mood. And yes, I probably overreacted, but it seems like you just don't even care about my family. We never even see them. And so now you've opened up the gates. So what just happened in that conversation? The person kind of gave you a test balloon, like a little weather balloon. Can I really share what's on my mind and not get criticized, not get judged, and have the person help me with these feelings that I've been carrying around? And if you're able to hold that space, if you're able to say, yes, I'm the person who can do it for you, oftentimes much more comes out. And if you're not ready for it, it might get overwhelming. We went from talking about a coffee cup to her dead grandmother. And so it's like, oh no, like what did I do? But that's good. That's the relationship you should have, that you should want to have, is this kind of open forum. And the fact that you have been there and been still and able to listen will give them confidence that they don't have to hold things. And so you'll have to apologize less, because as soon as something happens, they'll tell you right away in the future. So that's step 2, is asking, is there anything else? And that's a big part of it.
It is a big part of it. What's really interesting about that too is a lot of times you can get stuck in this back and forth, this sort of arguing process, because in your mind, you're like, it's a freaking teacup.
Right.
Like, I'll go commission somebody to make you another one. I'll give them pictures, right? They'll make it. You won't even know it's not the same one that you had, like, as guys will come up with solutions like that. Yeah. But that, is there anything else, lets you know that it's not really about
and I slid something in the is there anything else in her answer, which is, and I overreacted, right? So oftentimes when you give someone space, there will be some admission that they're out of line a little bit. Not always, but oftentimes if you give somebody that kind of patience, they'll half apologize or at least acknowledge their role in it. And if you're listening for it carefully, that might be soothing to you, because you might not be like the best apologizer to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. So what that leads us to the next step then.
So the next step, I mean, you keep saying, is there anything else? When the person says no, that's everything. If you're a good body language kind of spotter, you'll see a weight lifted off of them because now they've gotten it all on the table, which is really helpful. At that point, the next step is repeat everything in summary so that they know you actually were listening and got it. So in this case, I'd be like, I had no idea how much time and effort you put into getting the perfect coffee cup. Clearly, you spent so much time and you even called the manufacturer and they don't even make it anymore. So, what I broke is irreplaceable. And it also reminded you of your grandmother. You've been having a hard time and I didn't know about that either, and yada, yada. And then you ask, am I understanding everything? And if the person says yes, you're golden. Now they might say, well, you're missing this part. And when I do this with couples in session, very often you will miss a piece of it. And so you say, well, what am I missing? And you just kind of go and go and go until you get, yes, that's everything. Yes, you're getting everything. You want two yeses there. At that point, you can apologize. An apology before you do that isn't a full apology, right? But that's how you build empathy. You gave me time, you gave me patience, and you confirmed that you knew everything. And then you could say, look, I'm so sorry that happened. I had no idea. It was a mistake. I didn't do it intentionally. I hope you believe me when I say that. I know I can't replace your coffee mug. I'd love to go out and shop for a new one with you if as any kind of consolation. And in the future, I'll be, much more careful with your things. And that's it. And usually the apology is the shortest part of it. It's just, but the listening could take a half hour, and the repeating and making sure you get it. That's key.
Yeah, that's huge. That's such a funny example that you use too, because my wife and I, in all the years we were together, we never really had an argument. We had like three disagreements throughout that time, that took a little bit of, process, but we never really had an argument. But the reason why that example was so funny is because I remember one time we were having a conversation and it wasn't an argument or anything. I tend to get like really passionate about stuff. And she had this little Japanese tea set with these little Japanese tea mugs, and we were both holding one. And I'm like getting all animated, it's empty at this point because I've finished drinking, but it's still in my hand. And I'm like, and this thing just flies out of my hand.
Oh, man.
I don't even know how. I'm just like, I don't know how it's just like somehow just went flying out of my hand. And of course, breaks into multiple pieces on the floor. She was really not happy about that. So even though we weren't having an argument, I still had to apologize for breaking one of her favorites.
Sure.
Which then I decided, since it was a Japanese tea set, obviously I needed to find a way aside from apologizing to make this right for her. So, the Japanese have this art of fixing broken pottery.
With gold.
Yeah. So I put her thing back together that way.
Wow, you really went the extra mile. That's super cool.
Yeah, but it's just so funny as you're telling that story. I'm like, oh yeah, I've been there. I broke the cup.
Yeah, and it could get pretty granular and it's like, you always do this. You're so clumsy. It can go in a million directions. So you have to really build the strength to realize you're going to get kind of pooped on a little bit in this process, but know that you're still a good person. So you have to have confidence in who you are and able to stand there and work through this. But that's part of what's interesting about it for the person, is that they see, oh, they're strong enough to sit here and like take the arrows and still love me. That says a lot.
It does, indeed. I was very fortunate in that situation that she was well aware of my tendencies to get animated. And so she wasn't too bothered by it. She was a little sad that I broke it, but then she was happy when it was fixed and put back together. And it had a little character to it.
Very fun.
Okay. We're pretty much out of time, but, by the way, sharing that formula was super, super valuable. So I'm really glad that you shared that. I did have a question that I want to ask, because I do think it's kind of important. And that is, what are some of the things you shouldn't say in an apology?
But You have to understand my perspective. I think you're overreacting. Like anytime you're shifting blame to back to the person or you're defending your actions, you've kind of gone on the wrong track. It's natural for people to want to defend themselves and say, but it was an accident, or but you like you should know that I never meant anything by that. The person already knows all that. They would have left their anybody who's with someone and also thinking like they maliciously went out and to like wanted to hurt me, then they have their own psychological issues of codependency and stuff. Well, let's just assume that doesn't exist and you're in the relationship and the person's there because they love you. They want the apology because they want to rebuild the relationship. So if you get on this kind of road of, but I did it because you did this first, or but you're misinterpreting my actions. That's you're already way far in left field. The truth is, after you apologize, if you have this like itch to explain your perspective, you can ask. And I've done this with my own wife. I would sit there, do the whole process, and then say, apologize. And she said, thank you. And I would say, do you want to know what was going through my head and why I did it? And my wife will often say, not really, no. I'm happy. Like I got my apology. I go, great. And you just let it go.
Yes, yes. Easier said than done for a lot of people. I was actually I was hanging out with two friends recently, and they got into a little bit of an argument. And what was really interesting about that is in that process of arguing, they both actually made the points that they wanted to make. In other words, he was expressing what his intent was, and he actually was able to do that. He was actually able to express what his intent in that situation was. And she was actually able to express that she heard and understood what his intent was. So, for all intents and purposes, that should have been like, oh, okay, we've come to a resolution here. And yet it was not resolved. And they just kept trying to make the same point over and over again. So I kind of came in and said, okay. First to him, I said, she heard you. She understands that your intent was blah, 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 blah. Right. And then I had to go to her and go, okay, you heard that his intent, you get the point, right? So I had to literally pause them, time out, make sure that they actually heard it. And then here's the reason I bring this up is because it was the let go part where they failed.
Yeah.
Right. Because they heard each other. They made their points clear. They came to a resolution, but they couldn't drop it. They couldn't let it go.
Yeah. And I think the reason people have a hard time letting it go is because they think the person's going to do it again. And so if they don't see an expression of remorse, like explaining why you do something is different than being full of regret. Right. I mean, you could have a good reason. Like I could have a good reason for not showing up to dinner on time. It could be that I had a patient who was suicidal. It could be, and all of that would be legitimate excuses, right? I can name off more, but I think you get the point. But it doesn't change the fact that I still have to sit there and look at my wife and say, I'm really very sorry. And it was something I couldn't avoid, but I should have called. I should have done something to let you know what was going on. And that's my fault. Right. And suddenly it's like, oh, even though it was a legitimate reason, you're still taking responsibility, maybe suggesting ways to avoid it in the future. There's remorse clearly in the tone of your voice and in your body language. Those are the things that let people let go.
Yeah. And you hit the nail right on the head in their situation. The reason why they couldn't let it go is because this is a recurring pattern. And the fear was exactly what you said. You're going to do it again.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Sad.
Yeah.
We get in our own way most of the time. That's the truth.
That is really the truth. Well, Jon, I want to thank you for coming on. And before we go, I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to tell the listeners about your work, where they can find you. If they're interested in reading the book, which is everything we talked about and more in it, go ahead and tell them where they can find all that.
You could get the book anywhere books are sold, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, wherever. It's called Your Apology Sucks. My wife and I wrote it. It's the only book with that title, I believe, so it shouldn't be too hard to find. If you want to follow me on Instagram, that might be helpful. I give tips like this a lot in little 1-minute bursts, or on Facebook. My Instagram handle is John Saves Relationships with underscores between the words. If you want to work with me, I'm usually full. I don't know if I have space, but if you want to try and reach out and work with me, my website, I used to be a rabbi, so it's called mrspirituality.com, kind of a remnant from another life. You can find me there. But really, I just came on to share, some advice if it helps. And I'm sure Kevin's great. So if you want to work with Kevin, he's more than qualified to handle everything if I'm booked. But thank you for letting me be here and share some words.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. And I always love, I don't mind when people come on and they have stuff to promote. That's how we all do it, right? And it does actually even mean a little something else when somebody volunteers their time just because they want to get the information out there to people. So I really do appreciate that.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
All right, everybody, that's all the time that I have for this episode, and I will see you next week. I hope you liked this episode of the Love Lab podcast. If you enjoyed this show, subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. And for more free exclusive content, join me in the Passion Vault at kevinandceline.com/vault. That's kevinandceline.com/vault. Thanks for listening. And remember, as Celine used to say, you're amazing.